In Matthew 16:4, Jesus says, "A wicked and adulterous generation seeks out a sign, and a sign shall not be given to it except the sign of Jonah." In Luke 11:29 through 30, Jesus says, "This generation is a wicked generation. It seeks a sign, and a sign shall not be given to it except the sign of Jonah. For just as Jonah became a sign to the Ninevites, so also will the Son of Man to this generation." Early Christian thinkers and writers kept going back to Jonah as a prefigurement of the resurrection. For as Jesus was in the tomb and rose again on the third day, so did Jonah emerge from the belly of the fish on the third day. Origen made this connection. St. Augustine made this connection. Jerome made this connection. Irenaeus made this connection. Tertullian made this connection. These are among the biggest theological names of the first few centuries of the Christian faith. There are also many examples of images of Jonah emerging from the fish in early Christian art, especially in catacombs and on sarcophagi. The iconography of Jonah doesn't seem to be linked with Jesus' death and resurrection per se, but rather the strong linkage between baptism, death, and resurrection. Jonah becomes a symbol of baptism and new life after baptism. In Romans 6:4, "Thus by baptism into death we were buried with him, in order that just as the anointed was raised from the dead by the Father's glory, so we too might walk in newness of life." In Colossians 2:12, "Buried with him in baptism, by which you were also raised along with him by the faithfulness of the operation of the God who raised him from the dead." Baptism, death, and resurrection have been intimately linked since the earliest days of Christianity and the authoring of the New Testament. Jonah is thrown into the water. Jonah has this near-death experience in the waters, as we read in the Psalm from chapter 2. And yet, out of the waters, Jonah emerges quite miraculously, not only to a life again, but a new life where he goes and preaches God's word to the Ninevites. Fascinatingly, Jonah's connection to resurrection isn't limited to Christian writings and artists, but also Jewish teachers. There's a strong ancient Jewish tradition from at least as far back as the 2nd century BC that identifies Jonah as the son of the widow at Zarephath, who dies and who then Elijah brings back to life. This ancient tradition says that that little boy who died and then lived again is Jonah. Also fascinatingly, some Islamic traditions read Jonah's emergence from the fish as an act of rebirth. Islamic teachers identified Jonah freshly spewed out of the fish's mouth as a newborn and like an infant wrapped in swaddling clothes. These readings are interesting, and especially so for our purposes, the Christian linkages between Jonah and a possible foreshadowing of Christ's resurrection, but they also tend to completely minimize the ethical, spiritual, and missiological messages of the Book of Jonah. We can get so transfixed by the fish in the story that we forget that the story is really asking questions about what obedience to God looks like, what the implications of God's mercy are, and how God calls us to bring about God's vision for the world and make it a reality on earth as it is in heaven.